Yes, I want to thank you. The name of my talk is Adelbert Gruner, the most misunderstood villain in the canon. I want to first of all, the first half of this uh event has been great, and everybody has used PowerPoint, but not me. So I'm gonna paraphrase David Stewart Davies, who I heard him begin a talk one time by saying, "And now for the anticlimax." No PowerPoint, just me. There is something about bad guys in fiction, be it on this page or on the screen, that draws our attention and even in some cases our affection. Even the worst villain can exert a sort of magnetism and glamour that some might find appealing, or at least defendable. We'd never endorse this action ourselves, of course, but it is a tradition in local Sherlock Holmes societies during dinner meetings devoted to a particular story that toasts are offered to canonical characters. In my group, the illustrious clients of Indianapolis, it has often fallen to me to stand and toast and often defend the villain of the story. I've weathered slings and arrows in defense of many a bad guy. For instance, Jeffro Rucastle, who simply wanted to defend his emotionally fragile daughter from an opportunistic suitor, or John Clay, who was falsely portrayed as an aristocratic master criminal, but who actually was a Victorian Robin Hood. Abe Slaney, not the most dangerous crook in Chicago, but rather a scorned fiancé so in love he traveled all the way from Chicago in a desperate attempt to save his relationship. All misunderstood. As Holmes himself once said, circumstantial evidence is a very tricky thing. It may seem to point very straight to one thing, but if you shift your own point of view a little, you may find it pointing in an equally uncompromising manner to something entirely different. There is one villain, however, despite being genuinely misunderstood, that I will not defend, even in jest. And I am, of course, speaking of Baron Adelbert Gruner, the Austrian murderer. Would that murder be his only offense? Well, if that was the case, we might be able to give him some slack. I mean, after all, a good, juicy murder in a detective story is the air we breathe. But no, murder is the least of Baron Gruner's offenses. Gruner makes his appearance in The Adventure of the Illustrious Client, the late-era adventure of Sherlock Holmes. The hypnotic womanizer Gruner is engaged to a prominent member of society's daughter, and Holmes is persuaded by an illustrious client to intervene and prevent the marriage. Despite not having an actual mystery to solve, this story, with its overtones of sexual perversion and violence, and the thinly veiled member of the royal family who hires Holmes, is one of the most memorable of the later tales. It's a weird thing, but Gruner is a bit in vogue lately. There's probably something to be made of there. There have been a flurry of articles and social media posts about this villain recently. For instance, in the summer 2023 issue of the Baker Street Journal, there is a paper entitled "In Defense of Baron Gruner" by criminal defense lawyer Rich Kriskunas, who is here with us today. In it, Rich ably demonstrates how a defense lawyer goes about defending his client. Quote, "No matter how heinous the crime, no matter how reprehensible the client." He then mounts a point-by-point attack on the evidence against the defendant and concludes by urging us to, quote, "reread this story with an open mind and try not to be swayed by the statements of Holmes and Watson, as well as media adaptations." It's an excellent example of how to defend even a scumbag like Baron Adelbert Gruner. Additionally, the Baker Street Irregulars have an entire volume devoted to the illustrious clients. I happen to have it right here in their manuscript series, Clutches of a Fiend, which I am honored to have edited. Clutches of a Fiend not only reproduces the manuscript of the story, but also features a number of articles highlighting the doings of Baron Gruner, who is oddly in vogue. I have no intention of defending Gruner. Therefore, when I assert that he is the most misunderstood villain in the canon, I mean something entirely different. Most readers misunderstand just how bad Baron Adelbert Gruner is. Gruner is misunderstood because he is hands down the worst villain in the canon. And not only is he the worst, but he is also the only completely modern villain in the entire canon. Something that is entirely unrecognized by virtually every Sherlockian scholar. First, we'll look at why he is the worst, and then we'll talk about why he is the modern villain. The Adventure of the Illustrious Client appeared in 1924 and was gathered into the final collection of Sherlock Holmes stories known as the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, published in 1927. For the Sherlock Holmes reader, faithfully working his way or her way through the canon, full of gaslit mysteries, missing papers, poisoned darts, ciphers. Once we are in the casebook, it is replete. It seems we have somehow wandered into a completely different set of tales. The casebook is replete with shocking motifs and elements unique in all the canon. Brutal beatings, disfigurement, paranoia, sexual perversion, suicide. You name it, and it's in there. And worst of all, Sherlock Holmes even writes his own stories. Just to further illustrate how different the casebook is, here's a quick summary of some of the total weirdness found in this collection. We have paranoia, jealousy, and psychotic rage in the Thor Bridge. Never did I realize till that moment how this poor creature hated me, writes Grace Dunbar, governess in the home of millionaire Neil Gibson, of his wife, Maria Gibson. When Mrs. Gibson detects that her husband wants more than a professional relationship with the young governess, it drives the woman mad with jealousy and rage. She was like a mad woman. She poured her whole wild fury out in burning and horrible words. It was dreadful to see her. I put my hands to my ears and rushed away. When I left, she was standing, still shrieking out her curses at me in the mouth of the bridge. Mrs. Gibson was so consumed with hate, she committed suicide in order to exact revenge upon her romantic rival. Then there's lust-driven science. That's weird. Some consider The Creeping Man to be a science fiction story. Well, it is fiction and there is science, but really it's the story of a retirement-age professor's distasteful and inappropriate desire for a woman young enough to be his, at least, daughter. In an effort at rejuvenation, the professor starts injecting himself with a serum made from monkey glands, hoping to, as Holmes puts it, gain his wish by turning himself into a younger man. At the end of the tale, Holmes asks the timely question, what sort of cesspool may not our world become? Indeed, where else in the canon do we see the level of savage physical assault and disfigurement that we do in the casebook? The answer is nowhere. The casebook has not one, but two facial disfigurements. The Veiled Lodger is the terrible story of Mrs. Ronder, a former circus worker who had suffered having her face torn off by a lion. And then again, in our favorite, The Illustrious Client, Baron Gruner has his face horribly disfigured by a vitriol attack. This story also has Holmes being beaten so badly that it makes the papers. But savage physical assault isn't the only element to be found in The Illustrious Client. It isn't even the worst element. No, The Illustrious Client stands out for featuring a villain who is utterly unique, Baron Adelbert Gruner, the only thoroughly modern villain. Baron Adelbert Gruner, the sexual predator, a villain who collects women, who takes photographs and keeps them in a book, a villain who ruins them before moving on to the next one. Just contemplate that. It is an amazing and almost unbelievable material for an adventure of Sherlock Holmes. Now, I think it would be instructive to examine collectors and the activity of collecting. There is an actual clinical discipline devoted to the psychology of collecting. It is an area of study seeking to understand what motivates people to devote time and money and energy making and maintaining collections. I admit that when I began diving into the ramifications of Baron Gruner, I had not anticipated ending up wondering about the psychology of collectors. The psychology of collecting looks at the spectrum of all activities, all the way from being recognized as a beneficial hobby on one end, all the way to being a mental disorder on the other. I am a Sherlockian collector. Books, artifacts, you name it, as well as being a collector of a few other things. I began to feel a little uncomfortable as I imagine a number of you who are hearing this. While we all have likely known a collector or two whose activities border on being a mental disorder, I am confident that most of us fall well within the beneficial hobby category. But Baron Gruner, a collector of women, that's a different thing. On the habit of collecting, Susan M. Pierce of the University of Leicester comments that the objects have to be deliberately viewed by their owner as a collection. And this implies intentional selection and pursuit, acquisition, and disposal. It also means that objects have a value which contribute to the collector's sense of identity. This is all fine if we're talking about collecting first editions or toy robots or stamps, but it is a chilling and frightening thing when applied to a man who collects women. As with many collectors, Gruner has a variety of interests. Sir James Damery tells Sherlock Holmes, he has expensive tastes. He is a horse fancier. He collects books and pictures. He is a man with a considerable artistic side to his nature. He is, I believe, a recognized authority upon Chinese pottery and has written a book upon the subject. But it fell to a woman named Kitty Winter, a former mistress and a member of Gruner's collection of women, to enlighten us in detail about this particular area of his collecting interest. She says that Gruner collects women. He takes pride in his collection, as some men collect moths or butterflies. He had it all in a book, snapshot photographs, names, details, everything about them. It was a beastly book, a book no man, even if he had come from the gutter, could have put together. But it was Adelbert Gruner's book all the same. Souls I Have Ruined. Dr. Ruth Formanek, in the Journal of Social Behavior and Personality, asserts there is a commonality to all motivations for collectors of all kinds, and being a passion for the particular things collected. She adds that, quote, I think that the acquisition of sexual trophies, even in the most deranged individuals, are within this motivational typology, and in that such individuals clearly have a passion for what they do. And I would argue that the behavior is an extension of the self. In his book, Serial Murderers and Their Victims, Dr. Eric Hickey notes that when it comes to collecting in this darker side of the spectrum, many serial killers are known for their habits of collecting trophies, souvenirs. Am I saying Gruner was a serial killer? No, not exactly, although Kitty Winter alludes to murders in the plural. To be considered a serial killer as defined by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you must be a person who has committed a series of three or more killings, having common characteristics such as to suggest the reasonable possibility that the crimes were committed by the same actor or actors. The FBI states that there are certain traits common to serial murderers, including sensation-seeking, a lack of remorse or guilt, impulsivity, the need for control, and predatory behavior. Some of these sound like Gruner, but it is hard to think of the Austrian nobleman in the same category as H.H. Holmes or Jeffrey Dahmer. So lacking more detail about his murders, I wouldn't go so far as to say he's a serial killer, even though murder is clearly part of his toolbox. But I think we can, with some certainty, assert that Baron Gruner is a sexual predator and a sociopath. Now, I am not a mental health professional, and the point of this paper is not to diagnose Gruner's psychological status. I will just briefly state why I believe this, and then we'll move on to what it means for his status as a canonical villain. Catherine Ramsland, in her book, Inside the Minds of Sexual Predators, says sexual predators are analogous to how a predator hunts down its prey. So the sexual predator is thought to hunt for his or her targets. Rhonda Freeman, PhD, comments that these predators lack guilt, remorse, or shame and tend to enact sexually deviant acts throughout their relationships. They leave behind a long trail of broken spirits, trauma, and years of emotional torment and struggle for their victims to bear. Let's remember what Kitty Winter said. What I am, Adelbert Gruner made me. Very quickly, the early characteristics of a sexual predator are: the predator will be very attractive. He will be very much the answer to their dreams, a knight in shining armor, who would certainly never hurt them. They are being protected, loved, respected, and are the focus of the predator. From the story, it was on a Mediterranean yachting voyage. The villain attached himself to the lady with such effect that he has completely and absolutely won her heart. To say that she loves him hardly expresses it. The predator plays the victim. There's a real sense of grandiose behavior associated with this kind of person, never taking responsibility and always playing the victim. Again, from the story, the cunning devil has told her every unsavory public scandal of his past life, but always in such a way as to make himself out to be the innocent martyr, and she absolutely accepts his version and will listen to no other. He pushes her boundaries sexually. He'll get a huge kick out of this and is likely to be vigilant in his approach, regardless of the victim's fear and anxiety. Again, we go back to Kitty Winter's words about the diary. Snapshot photographs, names, details. Ask yourself, what are the pictures of? And what are these details? Is there anyone in the entire Sherlockian canon worse than this? A sexually predatory murderer who preys on vulnerable women, collecting them as trophies. What is a bank robber or thief next to this? Even the Napoleon of crime would, I venture to say, find Gruner beyond the pale. For Moriarty, it is all business. You have a problem, a crime to be done, a paper to be abstracted, a house to be rifled, a man to be removed. Professor is contracted, and the job is done. But this, no, this is something entirely different. So now I'll talk about why he is the only modern villain in the canon. Prior to the late 1800s, sex crimes and criminals were rarely depicted in the media. However, the sensational cases of H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper set a cultural idea of the predator for years to come. There's no doubt that these true serial killers were dreadful, but it worked to take the light off of a more subtle and harder to see creep like Baron Gruner. There is a concept called the culture of violence theory. It is complicated, but theorizes societal dimension to crime and abuse in Western culture. This concept is a 20th century one. As I said toward the beginning of this talk, the case book of Sherlock Holmes, and especially the illustrious client, present themes and motifs and motivations entirely unlike those from Victorian times, especially from before World War I. Baron Gruner could only have appeared in the canon of Sherlock Holmes in this modern post-World War I era. Of all the villains from the casebook, none rise to, or perhaps sink to, the level of Gruner. That war had many names. Early on, it was the war in Europe. Some knew it by the now ironic title, The War to End All Wars. At the end of the shooting, it had become the Great War. And a couple of decades down the road, we were forced to call it World War I. Whatever it was called, the conflict engulfed Europe in a terrible, mechanized, total war with all the industry and science of the Victorian era's Industrial Revolution behind it. In England alone, 703,000 young men were killed and 1,663,000 wounded, nearly an entire generation in such a relatively small country. In some sense, the 1920s, the era of the illustrious client, can be seen as inevitable. The generation that followed the First World War rebelled against society's morality and mores. Social patterns, political ideas, and entertainment, they all experienced radical changes during this time. The 1920s ushered in a coarseness and vulgarity and brutality to the culture that endures to this day. Indeed, it has only grown and amplified as the decades have elapsed. Detective fiction was not immune, and the Holmes stories reflect this shift. Arthur Conan Doyle wasn't writing historical fiction when he penned An Adventure of the Great Detective. The Holmes books were never intended to be period pieces. Quite the contrary. Doyle was always writing contemporary detective stories and crime fiction. For readers who see Holmes only existing in the cozy, gaslit Victorian age, it must come as a shock to learn that the adventures of Sherlock Holmes are not immune to the spirit of the age. It is not that someone like Baron Gruner could not have existed before the 20th century. There have undoubtedly been dreadful human beings throughout human history. But I do believe that the recognition of, and especially the portrayal of, this type of villain in the stories of Sherlock Holmes could only have come in the 20th century. And in all of the canon, and in all of the casebook, there is only one villain that fits that bill: Adalbert Gruner, the Austrian murderer and collector of women, the only modern villain, and hands down, the worst of the worst. Thank you.